Greetings, traveler. It can happen so many times when we're working on game design that the time comes to decide the damage that we should assign to the main player, to his abilities and so on, but that number just doesn't come up. We have no system of reference for deciding how much damage that should be, and even if we do, we just don't know if this number will work out in the game. Perhaps we assign a number randomly, but then we go and do something else in game design and come back and see that this number makes no sense at all. So today we'll be going over how to decide how much damage the player should do, or how much power each ability should have, or how strong each aspect of the player character feels. And I'm going to give you my 3-step framework for how to decide this, even if you're starting from scratch. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 13 years now, and this is a topic that I could never find any type of material to help me in my search. Out there is no recipe for saying how much damage something should do, what's a good value, what's a good range. Basically, I could find nothing like that. And when I asked my colleagues, they only said, well, try things. Which was good. It's a way to start, but I wasn't quite happy with this approach. I wanted something more systematic and organized. So this is what I came up with. First of all, there's a basic assumption to have about all this, and that is that you want to make it so that if the player uses his strengths, then he will win. If the player doesn't use the items or the powers or the abilities he has at his disposal in the most efficient way possible, then he's expected to lose. What I mean by that is that, let's say you have your player character as an expert swordsman. With a sword, he's super cool. He also has a kick attack for, maybe dealing with small enemies that are immediately around him, but the kick attack is nowhere near as powerful as the sword attack. Now, if that player for some reason decided to attack all the enemies he comes up with the kick attack, then he's expected to not win. He is expected to lose, because we're trying to teach the player in this scenario that the sword attack is the main strength of this character, and that is what is necessary to conquer the path ahead. Is this to say that you cannot have a game where the kick attacks are strongest? Of course not. You can have a game about literally whatever you want. But for this example to make sense, let's go with this mentality. So that is the basic assumption we need to get started, that the player will eventually, throughout the game, learn what the strengths of the character are, together with the game showing that through tutorials, giving hints through specific enemies that are designed to lose more easily to the player's main strengths. Eventually the player is supposed to understand that, okay, my character is good at this thing, or like these 3 things. I should be using those to conquer my challenges and not basically anything else that maybe he wants to try. That is the general way to guide the player towards building more and more his strength. So this basic assumption is necessary to understand before we move into the 3 steps. So now that we have that, let's move to the first step. What we want to do is come up with a framework that sort of automatically tells us how much damage something should do, right? So instead of us saying, for the attack score of this character, is 100 enough? Or is it 180 that's good? Or maybe over 9 million? What's a good attack value to choose for our character? Trying to think of it in numerical values like that is the hard mode of doing this, and basically, even if you decide a good value, you will find out that without a system of reference, you can finish this, go and balance something else in the game, and when you come back to look at the attack values, they make no sense because balancing other aspects has put this part of the game out of balance. So how can we create this system of reference? Well, first of all, we have to make an assumption for what our desired win rate is going to be based on the resources spent. And what do we mean by that? So let's say that this player character comes across an enemy And as it happens in most games, first you defeat easy enemies to learn the basics of the game, and then enemies become progressively stronger. But the player becomes progressively stronger as well, so there's a nice balance of challenge that the player faces at each adversary. So let's say that the player comes face to face with the first enemy, and we decide as game designers that that first enemy should be pretty easy to defeat. So we usually set how much time the player has to defeat this enemy with hit points. We say that the player has 10 hit points, for example, the enemy does 1 damage per attack, so the player has 10 hits worth of time to defeat the enemy if he's at full hit points. Now, this hit point is the resource of the player, let's say the time of the player. So for very, very easy enemies, or for players who are amazingly expert at the game and at using their skills, perhaps they don't need to spend any resources, any hit points or consumable items or something like that to defeat an enemy. But for players who are just starting the game, they likely only know one attack, or they only know how one button works in the game. So we can't expect them to be so adept yet. So we say that for this initial player, they should be able, for example, to defeat the first enemy by spending, let's say, 50% of their resources, of their hit points in this case. So that gives us a base for the calculation we're going to do next with our attacks and how much damage each one does. So now that we have decided this, so that, for example, the player should defeat the enemy in, let's say, 3 hits if they connect, but of course he's going to have many failed attempts. And for the time it takes for the player to deal 3 hits, then the enemy will have dealt 50% of the player's damage to the player. So that's the time. And of course, if the player needs more time, then there's still more hit points to be consumed on the player's side if he needs more time to learn. Or if the player understands the mechanic quickly, then he can defeat the enemy in 3 hits before taking the 5 hits that we assumed. So he has some hit points left over. That's the desired outcome that we just decide that it would create a good experience for the player right at the beginning of the game. So with that decided, let's move on to the next step. The next step is for us to list all the different powers of the player. So everything that the player has at their disposal. And by that, we mean all the possible attacks. So I mentioned before the sword attack and the kick attack for this sample ninja game. If there's others, now is the time to list them. And now the question arises, well, how do I decide what attacks my player has? Very good question. It is literally up to the game designer to decide what would express best the theme and the abilities of this character. So I have an example ready to show you in a few moments, but when you think of this, basically you can think of anything you want, right? Let's say you're designing a grand strategy game where you have an army and the enemy has an army, and you say, well, when we're thinking about big armies, what components are there? There's the infantry, there's the cavalry, the archers, the artillery, maybe boats take part in combat, maybe wizards take part in combat, right? It's up to you to decide what elements best represent this world. And here you want to have a close matching between the overarching theme of the game and the elements you decide to have. So there's, of course, a way to go very wrong with this. Let's say you're making a very, very realistic modern shooter kind of game with real soldiers and real weapons and all that. If you decide that there is a magical power in the game, or a magic grenade, or a teleportation thing and so on, of course you can do that, but that immediately changes the tone of the game. We're no longer talking about realistic modern combat. We're talking about more like sci-fi type of experience or more fantasy type of experience. But selecting this kind of ability layout or power layout very much tells the story that you want to say. Conversely, if you want to make a fantasy game about medieval combat and suddenly you add modern tanks and machine guns and computers and so on into combat, then again, that takes the experience away from fantasy and closer to modern, more realistic warfare. So this is a key point when selecting what sort of group of abilities you want to stay close. Again, we'll have a look at an example in a moment, so you'll see more specifically what I mean. So once we have that list, the last part is to assign a percentage of power assign a percentage of strength to each power. What do we mean by that? So in the initial example with the ninja with the sword and the kick ability, we said that the sword has way more power than the kick. And this is a step where we assign that in numbers. So it could be, for example, that from the total attack power of the player, which is, let's say, 100%, then the strength of the kick is only 10% and the strength of the sword is 90%. So if you want to put it in specific values, then the damage that the kick does is 1 and the damage that the sword does is 9. So you can use this framework to assign power to all the moves. And the way you assign this power basically tells the story of what this particular character is good at. And of course, it doesn't have to be a specific character, right? It could be applied to an army, or it doesn't have to be a combat game at all. It could be a racing game where you say, for example, well, in my modern modifications-based racing game, what I want to show off is that a stock car is not so fast, but a well-modified car, even if it's not fast, can become really, really quick. So quick that it even outpaces supercars out there, for example. So if this is the story you want to tell, then throughout the game, you have to say that the car, for example, goes to 100 kilometers an hour by itself, by default. But if you fit a good turbo, it can go to 130, or it can accelerate in half the time or something. So you show off how big the impact of the modification is like that. And similarly with nitrous and better exhausts and all sorts of modification style changes, you say that these things affect the performance of the car so much more than the stock equipment that comes with the car. And of course, you can apply the same mentality to any other game as well. So enough about the theoretical stuff. Let me pause for a moment and let's see a more specific example. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a sample game that doesn't exist called Ninja Fight. So in this game, the player is a ninja and he's coming across different adversaries. So this could be other player characters, but it could be also NPCs. So this applies to both cases. So for each adversary, we have decided beforehand how easy it's going to be for the player to defeat that enemy. So hit points, magic shields, temporary hit points, all these things basically dictate how much time the player has to use the abilities that we decide to defeat the enemy. So just as we decide the hit points and the abilities, the shield and the temporary hit points and so on, we also decide the list of powers the player has to defeat the enemy. So let's take a look at our sample here. We have 4 different powers that the player can use in this case: the punch attack, the kick attack, the shuriken attack, and the sword. Notice how I used only ninja themed abilities, and between all of them, probably the punch is the least ninja-ish, but still it's martial arts, so it kind of fits. I could add machine gun attack here, but that would make it a very modern game. It would take it away from the medieval ninja style game. I could also add, again, magical attacks, or let's say ride-by attack from a motorcycle and so on, but again, it would change the theme of the game. If that's something you want to explore, by all means. You can have some cyberpunk style motorcycle ninja cyborg crazy character that can do way more than that. But to keep it simple, let's just assume that these are the 4 things that our ninja character can do. So to teach the player that, look, these are all the things the ninja can do, and they're all useful in different scenarios, but from all these things, we want, for example, to focus mostly on the sword attacks. We want to say that from all the things the player can do, the sword attacks are the most powerful. The player should be using those to defeat most enemies. The other ones are still useful, but in different scenarios. Maybe they can disable the enemy, maybe they can attack from distance, but we're not concerned with that right now. We are concerned with an enemy who is meant to be defeated in close quarters. So how can we tell the player that, look, from all these things, you should be using the sword. That's what this guy is best with. So we take the total amount of damage that is available to this player. And from that total, we distribute it down to all the different attacks the player can do. So we said that punch shouldn't be so strong, so maybe 20%, and for the kick, again, a bit stronger than the punch, so maybe 30%. We're already at 50. So for the shuriken, actually no, these are already too strong, so let's cut them down a bit. Let's do 10 and 20%. For the shuriken actually should be very weak in this case, to show that yes, it's great that you can throw it over distance, but it's not that deadly for this particular character. So maybe 5% is better for this. And that leaves us with what? 65% for the sword. So the player will eventually, by testing out all these abilities, should see that, whoa, when I use a sword, I do so much more damage. That's what I should be using as much as possible from now on. And that will also dictate to us how much rather the numerical value of all these attacks should be eventually. And this power distribution is very useful because it's very malleable for all numbers. So now we're dealing with percentages. Sometimes these are called weight values. But if eventually in the game we'll have to use actual numbers, integers or floats or something like that. So whether we're dealing with an integer value of 100 eventually, or it can be a very normalized value, something like something like 359.33, sorry for my horrible letters, no horrible numbers. So this can easily be applied to each one of these abilities with a simple mathematical calculation on the game engine side. So this system keeps us very adaptable when we're thinking about the numbers. It gives us a way to decide specifically how much damage, let's say, the kick should do based on an overall power of the player. And having specific numbers like that, we can also decide, so something like, let's say that we did it based on 100 attack power, so the sword should have 65 attack value, and we said in the beginning that we want this character to be able to beat the enemy in 3 strikes. So 3 times this is what? 195 or so. So if the enemy has, let's say, 190 hit points total, then this, for example, attack will beat the enemy in 3 strikes, and we stay true to the assumption we did in the beginning. If the player instead tries to use the punch or the kick or the shuriken, he will find that it's more difficult to beat the enemy because it simply takes more hits to defeat him. So that's it. That's the very, very simple way to think about it and automatically be able to decide specific values for all these things. And hopefully this also gives you the framework for how to think about damage and the meaning of combat, or the meaning of the power growth of the player over time, way before you get to the point where you have to assign specific values to specific powers. And of course, we just spoke about a single character here having attack power and so on and different abilities, but you can apply this to anything. You can apply it to strategy games, you can apply it to music games, that look, if you use this type of tunes you have better results. Or you can apply it to swimming games and say our swimmer player has arm strength and leg strength and technique bonus and so on, and if he uses these particular things that are good about him, then he should be able to beat his adversaries more or less easily as we desire. And let me make one last note before closing, a bonus point on this. So for example here, we saw that this particular character has this power distribution. He's really good with the sword, he's not so good with the rest. There's no reason why you should contain yourself to that. Perhaps this is the first character of the game, but why not have 3 characters in the game and have the second character be better with shurikens and the third character be better with punches and kicks, be more of a close quarters, hand-to-hand kind of character. And when you think about it, this is exactly what fighting games do. And of course, this is what every game does, but it's interesting to see that when you develop a system like this, where you say that, look, these are the total abilities of the players or of the main character, and from all these abilities, this particular one is what this specific character is really, really good at. If he uses it more than the others, and if he masters it, he should be able to win way more easily than using the stuff he's not good at. And this is exactly what fighting games do. They have a general system where we dictate what sort of moves are possible to begin with. Are ranged attacks possible? Are grabs possible? Are kicks possible? And so on. We just define the big list. And then we populate the game with different characters who are better at particular attacks compared to the attacks they're not good at. So one character can be really, really good at grabs. So the idea there is that if that character gets to use the grabs that he has, the hand locks and so on, then he deals so much damage, then it's very easy for him to win. But if another character who is good at kicks uses his kick attacks mostly and he gets them to connect, then that character will win way more easily than if he was using his punches or his grabs or whatever. And so you might think, well, what happens when a guy who's good with grabs uses the grabs and another guy who's good with kicks uses the kicks? Well, there you have a very good skill-based scenario where it's not a question of whether you will win if you use your strong point, but getting yourself in a position where you can use your strong point. So maneuvering, closing the distance, faking, making the opponent fall into your trap and all that. But perhaps that's a topic for another day. Anyway, there you have it. That's my simple 3-step framework. If this is useful to you or if you have questions about it, please let me know down below. I'll be very happy to respond in any way I can. Anyway, thanks again, as always, for your time, and have fun.